There we are.
Okay, waiting for the stream to go live. Okay, we are live. Welcome everybody to the phototherapy photo hour, happy hour, I should say.
Well, it's definitely a happy hour, and we know there's a lot of crazy things going on in the world, a lot of stress, a lot of negative stuff. But this is the place to come to escape all of that. So we want to welcome our viewers, our listeners from around the country, and as Wolf Blitzer would say, around the country and around the world. So we want to thank Juan for putting this all together. He's like not only a great photographer, but he's a tech whiz who makes all this happen. We want to thank Alec, our moderator, Alec Aarons. And Alec is actually getting very good at bird photography. So on the phototherapy page, I see Phyllis agreeing that she's really liking Alex's picture. And what we're doing now is we're having really cool, talented, and young guests like Don Komarechka. You'll see Don over there. I love Don because when I first met him, I think it was at the Can-Am Expo. Don, was that right, up in Buffalo?
Yeah.
Or maybe it was on the other side.
Anyway, I think it was in Buffalo that year.
So Don is, I call him the king of close-ups. He is a master. As you will see, you will be blown away by his artistry, his technique, his passion, his enthusiasm, and I could go on and on. But I really like him because he reminds me of myself when I was at that age. You know, I had dark curly hair.
It's the hair.
But I still try to have the enthusiasm, and I hope I do. But Don's enthusiasm, Don loves, close-ups as much as Juan loves bison. And you're right. I mean, you guys are both really passionate. And I think this is really what makes a great photographer. I know Phyllis is here. We want to welcome Phyllis and Joe and Linda Cullivan up there with a picture that she took at the Buddhist temple. Is that correct? She's agreeing by my house. We want to thank Lynn, who's a regular here. So, before we get going, Juan has an announcement, because what we're going to do is actually, Don is going to share some of his amazing pictures. And actually, if you've been tuning in for a while, you know that Juan and I show our pictures, like our wildlife pictures, right? Our close-up pictures, our bird pictures. We're not showing any of our pictures this week because Don's pictures are just so amazing. But Juan has a little announcement about our sessions here.
Well, yeah, I mean, we want to get this to be a little more interactive than what we've been doing. So we're going to have some changes for next week. And this is kind of a dry run, if you will, by having Dawn join us. So be on the lookout for announcements on Facebook as well. I'll send an announcement out to our mailing list to let people know, what the changes are going to be. But hopefully these changes are going to be for the better. There's not... we like to have the interaction of you guys and guests that are coming onto the show. So we're going to make a couple little changes. The way you're going to interact with us is going to be a little different than what we've been doing in the past, but hopefully it'll be for the better. And as always, we love to hear your feedback. If you have any questions or you have any suggestions, just make sure to let us know, and we'll make adjustments along the way. And, like we said at the beginning, we're kind of trying to figure out what works best for everybody. We started doing this just on Zoom. Then we started broadcasting on Facebook Live. And this next change is going to be kind of like the next evolution of what we're doing. So
because we want to bring it to more people.
Right. We want to bring this to more people, and we want to get more interaction with you guys out there.
Before we get going, I just unmuted, and KJ, is that how you say your name? How is it?
It's Kaya.
Kaya is posting amazing pictures on the group. Thank you. So, and where are you? Where are you?
I'm in Prague, in the Czech Republic.
Okay, so for those of you, you could just raise your hand. Do you guys know Nick Page? Anyone know Nick Page? Okay, Phyllis knows Nick's page. Nick Page, every place he takes a picture around the world, around the country, he marks it as Mesa Arch in Utah because he doesn't want to spoil it. He doesn't want to have 1,000 people photographing the same location. So you're posting amazing pictures from Prague. So maybe you want to tag them like Mesa Arch because, I mean, that picture you have of the ghost church,
Mm-hmm.
that is just an amazing picture. So maybe someday Juan and Alec and myself, we could come over there and do a workshop. So
That would be amazing.
So thank you. Thank Phyllis. I'm looking at Nathan for posting pictures. Steve, Arlene, Linda Marshall is here. She's posting an amazing picture. And George Condo Jonas is here. He was our guest on Saturday. Our next live session after this, by the way, is going to be on Saturday at 11 a.m. right here on the Facebook page on book publishing. So if you have an idea about publishing a book, please tune in. And on that note, the young, talented, enthusiastic, energetic, good-looking, curly-haired guy, our guest Don, is going to share some of his pictures that are going to be in his new book, which is going to be called
The Universe at Our Feet, macro photography. And it's going to be this wonderful tome of knowledge that I'm trying to put everything I possibly can into in terms of gear and technique and post-processing and everything else. And it is really playing by a different rule book, Rick. As you know, you've done a lot of this stuff and it's challenging and it's got its own set of challenges that you wouldn't normally face when you're a landscape photographer or portrait photographer. They have their own set of challenges. And so we have a lot of fun with it, especially because you can do it at home right now on your kitchen table and in your backyard, right? There's a lot of joy to be had there in the craziness of self-isolation.
So can we?
It sounds like you'd made the best of it.
My sanity has been slipping away a little bit, but that actually lends to creativity. So why don't we take a look at what some of this might become?
And we want to encourage our listeners to ask questions about behind the scenes, because Don has some behind the scenes shots in here. And just to start off, and I'll just turn it over to Don here. This is why I'm not showing any of my shots.
Well, okay, Rick. I've got your book on butterflies and some other work that you've done on a macro scale, and it's definitely very inspiring. So
thank you.
With the kind of work that I'm doing here, I want to instill the simplicity of the magic. And with an image like you're seeing right here, the value is that it's just the simplest possible ingredients that just have to be put together with a bare minimum of equipment. And then when I show you, like when I open the factory doors and show you how the sausage is made, it's not that terrifying, actually. It's just somewhat unexpected in some ways, where this is the behind the scenes for that particular image. And it's just a square vase that I guess you're supposed to plant succulents in that I've just filled to the brim with water. I've put a gerbera or a gerbera daisy in the background and a little purple floating flower from my garden in the foreground with a flash off on the side. And I had placed a weevil, a green weevil on that flower. And it was, to me, there's lots of elements of chance and randomness in order to get this to work, because things are fluid, things are floating quite literally. And a day can be spent on variations of this simple concept on a table in my studio. And, I might start at 9 a.m. and it's 4 o'clock and I'm wondering why I'm hungry, because the time floats by as you're trying to create stuff like this.
Pun intended.
Exactly. But, there's a lot of variations on these fun concepts. And
if we could I'm sorry to interrupt. If we could go back, are you using a macro lens for this?
So, yeah. So in this case, this was not done with a macro lens. This was done with an unexpected lens. I needed something that had a fairly small barrel diameter because in order to get the strongest reflections, like you see here, the reflections are really strong, really vibrant. The camera has to be as close to the surface of the water as possible so that the surface of the water is most perpendicular to the focal plane. And in order to do that, in order to get right up on the edge, I used an antiquated lens, an old triplet lens, a Trioplan 100, stopped down to around f11 or f16, and just piled extension tubes on the back of it. because that's not a macro lens. And you can
Right,
easily add extension tubes which fit between the camera lens and the camera body that shift the entire focusing range forward. And that kind of nestled right in on this corner here. You can see a couple of scrapes where the lens barrel might have hit it. That's what was used to do this. And the flash is just bare. There's no diffuser or what have you on it. And it's just on a manual flash power, probably its lowest power of 1/128th power, which is probably what I use for a lot of this stuff because it's at point blank range. David Stern in the comments asks where I buy the Weevil. I pay handsomely for my wife to go find one in the backyard. Actually, I just go and take them off of a bush. They're a pest. You can buy, however, ladybugs as an insect of interest because they're pest control bugs. And you can buy like 4,000 ladybugs for $30 from a pest control company. So that might be an option. This is even simpler of a design, where this is a tendril from a cucumber plant that I was growing to put into my garden. It's now giving us food just about every day, but this is when it was still indoors, and I just moved the whole pot into my studio. And the same concept in behind is a Gerbera daisy, almost the same colors as the previous one. And I've placed some droplets here strategically using a hypodermic needle, which is an easy thing to get. I mean, don't go pick them up off the street, but go onto Amazon. You can buy a pack of them for like $10, or if you happen to be diabetic, you already have insulin needles. And so that's the kind of stuff that would work exactly for this. And I placed one inside the little curve and then one down below. And this becomes artistry well before you pick up the camera. You know, I might go through a bunch of different tendrils, a bunch of different ideas. And if it doesn't work, I take a piece of paper towel twisted to a fine point and I poke at the droplets and it'll wick them all up. And then that kind of goes away, and then you restart. In this case, the one inside the curve is very aspherical. It's not a perfect orb like the one below, so it's got a distortion to it, but it adds color, it adds texture.
Yeah.
And this kind of imagery is all about lines and shapes and colors. And not fancy, expensive camera gear. This was done with a Lumix GX9, so a fairly small, compact micro four thirds camera. And I believe this was just a flashlight on the background, which is the same kind of setup that I used for this next image, where my goal for this shot was basically the same kind of concept as before. The flower had a dark center, and my goal was to have a dark center in the middle and this kind of fiery flowing spiral around it, like the accretion disk around a black hole, made in my basement, because I'm that mad scientist guy. And I didn't quite get there, but this I thought was a pretty cool concept. And that, I guess, illustrates the fact that no matter what concept you have in your head to start with, you're probably not going to get there, or you're going to go somewhere else because it's just more interesting as you continue to explore the ideas. And this image will make a lot more sense when I show you the behind the scenes photo in just a sec here. And I want to get some thoughts on this whole process too.
How long did it take you to make that image?
A day.
A day, yeah.
Because in order to get this wildflower seed, which is a piece of prairie smoke, to be a perfect semicircle just above the surface of the water at the scale that we're shooting at here, just creating the proper subject takes a significant amount of time. And then you get it, and then you spray it with water, and then it animates. As it gets wet, the little spines start moving and the water clumps up. And so you might have had the perfect semicircle that makes a perfect circle. And then seconds later, it's no longer that way, or the droplets just don't behave the way that you want. But this is the setup. And this is, again, where you can spend a lot of time just tinkering away in obscurity. Again, it's that same bowl. Any bowl that has a large flat base to it would work fine, because you're going to be putting things like these third hand tools in the background. They're also called helping hand tools. Easy to purchase them for a couple of bucks on Amazon. Buy more than one, especially if you're dunking them underwater, because they'll rust. And that's holding the flower in the background. But the lighting here is really key. And you'll notice that I've got a Platypod Max with some of their gooseneck arms with Lytra torches that are aiming at the flower in the background. And if you were looking at this from a cursory perspective, you might think that, oh, the attention's on the flower. It is, but the focus is on this tiny little seed that's being held by the clamps just above the surface of the water. And that's what the camera's pointing at. Notice that all of the light is on the background. None of the light is on the foreground whatsoever in order to make this shot work. That platypod bundle, by the way, you can get the lights, the gooseneck arms, and the platypod max from Platypod right now. They actually have a bundle. I'll actually put a link in the chat right now for you to take a look at that. Where if you're looking to do some macro lighting, it's a great bundle. The lights are waterproof too, so it's really helpful for exactly this kind of a scenario. But that's the thing that takes a lot of time and effort, not with the camera. The camera is the secondary component to make this shot work. Another interesting implementation here is that this is also not photographed with a macro lens. This is done with the Lumix 24 to 105 millimeter kit lens that comes with a lot of their full frame camera bodies. And the real trick here is that a lot of cameras, especially if they have an in-body image stabilizer, are now including a feature called a high resolution mode. And this mode will take multiple shots of the same scene, shifting the camera sensor by like a quarter of a pixel in various directions, taking between 5 and 16 different shots depending on the camera. And you can quadruple your resolution. And so what that means is my 47 megapixel camera becomes a 187 megapixel camera. And that's not useful for most people in any practical way. But in the sense of this particular shot, which is done with a very similar setup, I'm utilizing a clothespin here for Pete's sake. I'm just anything around the house that you could possibly use to start MacGyvering your setups together, and just a flashlight in the background. Now, that shot, using the high resolution mode, just like the previous one, created an image like this right out of camera. And I'm intentionally shooting further away than I'd like, because I know if I've got 187 megapixels, if I throw away 90% of that, I'm still going to have almost 19 very good megapixels, very good megapixels to play with. And that I've been shooting with 18 to 20 megapixel cameras my entire professional career. And that was obviously enough. The further away you get from a subject, the greater your depth of field will also be. So you don't have to go down the rabbit hole of focus stacking and intensive post-processing nonsense, which, yes, I still use for some things, and you'll see some examples of that. But when I crop that in to see the image that's just cropped and maybe some basic sliders and local adjustments in Lightroom, but nothing heavy, then this is what you get as a final result using that same logical process and the advancements of our technology that we have so much fun playing with.
Hey, Don, that is amazing. You're getting some really good comments here. Someone said, Linda Marshall said, I've heard Don on podcasts, but never saw his work. I now get why he is special. He's truly making a great picture. A couple of people have said, and I said this too, I used to think I was good at macro. So you're getting a lot of great comments in the chat here.
So, Don, I got a question for you. So,
yeah,
most of these shots, are you conceptualizing ahead of time, or you're just finding a few elements and playing around to try to come up with something? Meaning you're making the image as you go along, or you're conceptualizing before you even, create the setup?
Yes to both. I mean, there's always a pre-visualization methodology, right? You always come up with an idea, but what that idea evolves into is almost never what you originally thought it was going to be.
Right.
Case in point, the next image here, very similar shot process as some of the previous ones we've been seeing, where I placed a single droplet, and it was almost like, okay, well, let's just see if it sticks. And then I get this perfect sphere from that one droplet. And I'm like, I was planning on putting droplets on all of these petals up there. And I said, no, this is perfect the way it is, just with that one. And this was also shot with that high resolution mode. I did have to do focus stacking for this because the forget-me-nots have a fair amount of depth to them, but I only needed to use about 4 or 5 shots rather than the typical 20 or so that might have been required. And so my job was easier with the aid of the latest technology. And cameras from Panasonic and Olympus and Sony, and I'm sure other people are going to be introducing this kind of technology. If you are in the market for a new camera, just make sure that checkbox is checked. I think it's a really useful one to consider, at least for this kind of work. Or if you have this feature and you've never explored it, well, now might be a reason for you to start experimenting.
It is an amazing feature. My Sony has it, but yeah, like you said, it can only be used for still lives and things are not moving at all in the scene, because it takes a little while for all those shots to be made by the camera.
Exactly, which is why it would completely fail in this image, where again,
No, I'm laughing because this is just like amazing to me.
Well, again, this is about a day's worth of work. And a lot of times you might think, well, I'm not going to spend a day to make an image, but would you spend a day to drive to a location to take a photograph? Well, yeah, I've done that all the time. Well, I'm doing this at home. So compute your driving time into actual photographic process time. And you're still walking away with a useful image. Now, I can basically create the water droplets on this blade of grass. This is a blue fescue. A lot of bluegrasses will create spherical water droplets when you just spray them with water. And so I can do that almost blindfolded. Once you've done it a handful of times, it's kind of like riding a bike. You figure out where all the pieces go and you can put it all together. But getting that carpenter ant to cooperate. Ants are non-cooperative actors for the most part, and so they don't take direction very well. They'll like smush into all the droplets and carry them along with them, and they're oblivious to that stuff. So this was I don't know, attempt number 12 or 13, where the ant would just muck up all the droplets. I'd have to get a new blade of grass, or the ant would go on the bottom or just go backwards out of the frame. And I realized, okay, we'll clear off a little space for him to stand. Again, using a little piece of paper towel, soak up some of the droplets that might have been in that area so that he doesn't interact with them, and then hope. And I got this one frame where he was perfect. And then he started walking and mucking up all these other droplets. And while that was happening, I was ever so slowly swaying forward and backward because this was shot handheld. Because I didn't know where the ant was going to run along this blade of grass, exactly what the framing was going to be. So I was doing this handheld, and that ever so slightly different sway as I'm rapidly firing the camera shifted my focus. And that allowed me to do focus stacking of all of the droplets while the ant was running amok through everything else. And so that was a nightmare in post-processing, but I knew I had what was needed going in. And I got to do more of this stuff, Rick. It's really rewarding at the end of it, but I have spent entire days where I've just been skunked and there've been nothing useful.
Well, this is beautiful. If you could go back to the previous image, and I want to ask you a question about that, because like here, you know, Juan and I have talked about this and the black and white photography that Ansel Adams said, a picture's not done until you darken the edges. So you have like this like vignette here with the purple here. And if you could go to the ant picture, the amazing ant picture that we just saw, you have like a vignette on the bottom there. So do you think about this like so it draws more attention to the subject by adding that vignette?
Yeah, well, this is not technically an added vignette in post. This is this is an in-camera, because it's based on the differential between the center of the flower and its petals, which is in the same here. You can see the center of the flower creates this central blob, and beyond that, the petals themselves kind of come in, and they're out of focus. You don't really see what they are, but it creates that vignette concept.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. I mean, that's amazing to me that it's
so Rick, we did have a question from our good friend Freddie Clark, who's asking about the droplets and whether or not the droplets are pure water or if they're made with a solution.
This is a question I get almost every time, so thank you for asking that. These are just plain old water, tap water. I like to joke, if you want to be fancy, you can use bottled water, but it's not going to make any difference. But the reason why that's often asked about is because you see tutorials online about this kind of stuff, where people will always say, you know, add glycerin to the water because it'll change the viscosity of it. And it'll make the droplets stick more to surfaces and where it would otherwise roll off. Although suspiciously, none of those tutorials ever told you exactly what the ratio of water to glycerin was. And I did some experimenting with it and realized if you get a surface for which water would normally stick to, then you just need plain old water and that's it. Especially when glycerin water, and this was key for me, when glycerin water dries, it looks a lot like snail slime. And so I kind of serve double purpose when I go and I buy flowers for a photo shoot. Afterwards, I give them to my wife as a bouquet. And that's perfect and wonderful, unless it looks like they were marauded by an army of snails. At
I
which
think by
point,
now
it's
she's
not.
on to you.
Yeah. She knows the drill, and she's still
Right.
appreciative at the end of the day, especially when she sees this new bouquet of flowers at the exact same time when I'm posting new water droplet photos. I think she's drawn the connection. But yes, to answer that question, it's just plain old water.
Have you tried using sugar water to attract the ant and make him stick around, or?
So that was, I'm so glad you brought that up too, Juan, because these ants I found gathering around the peonies in my backyard, which for those that don't know, peonies have what's called extrafloral nectaries. They produce nectar on the outside of the flower before it blooms, and the ants are in circulating the flower looking for this little bits of sweetness and defending the flower as a result. And so they're after sugar water in this instance. And I was kicking myself. Like a year later, I realized, why did I not just fill a syringe with sugar water and put it on this one droplet right here in front of the ant? And then the ant would notice it and drink the droplet. How much better of a photograph would that have been if the ant was just drinking the droplet, and how much easier it would have been to take? So yes, well, and I thought about that a year after I took it, and thank you for reminding me.
Yeah, I would have been the same thing with me, that I would have done the exact same thing. I would have thought about it a year afterwards.
Yeah.
But I've done similar things like that with different animals that I knew were attracted to water, again, after many years of trying just plain water. So I'm glad to hear someone went through the same pain that I did.
Yes, yes. And in fact, I've done some follow-ups with this where instead of putting the ant on a blade of grass, I put him on 2 flower petals that were suspended in little arches in a pool of water, because then the ant could reach the end of one petal and would have nowhere to go. He's on an island of 2 petals. We'll just have to turn around and go back, and so on and so forth. And so he was a captive audience for that particular instance. And so the shot happened in, a quarter of a day rather than a full day. And so you learn
how many ants you have running around your house free?
I've lost count. No, because he's surrounded by water, I can easily poke a stick at him and put him back in a little jar, put him back outside with his colony, and no harm is done to anybody. He's had a drink of water and he's cooled off. So.
So Don, are these pictures going to be in your book? Your book is it's a coffee table how-to book. Is that correct?
And so it's going to have big, bright images, but it's going to be all informational. And I don't know if you've had a look, Rick. I did send you a copy at some point, but
yes.
It's going to be it'll answer every question you can possibly have. And I've heard a lot of the questions over the years from anything from, snowflake photography, which I've done a lot of. It's something that I've known quite a bit for, and that'll be in the book too. Which, I don't want to dwell too much on this stuff because it's out of season. We can't really utilize this right now. Maybe you'll have me back on in 6 months' time.
We will.
And it'll be a more meaningful discussion there. But sometimes there's just this method of discovery that we have as photographers, right? Where you think to yourself, wow, I've never seen something like that before, even though I've studied this subject immensely. And even with snowflakes, this is one I took last year, one of the rarest varieties, an arrowhead crystal that has 2 terminated ends to it, has never been seen before by anybody. And to find this 2 feet from your backyard, I think is just rewarding. And it's the reason why I call the book The Universe at Your Feet. You just don't know what it's going to be. And this is purely documentary work, but in the same season, you can do incredibly artistic and involved craftsmanship, let's call it. Because this is more than just knowing how to position the light and where to focus the camera and when to press the shutter button. This is creating a subject that wouldn't have otherwise existed. And I've said this before, macro photography, this is a freezing soap bubble, by the way, in the middle of the winter time, one shot of probably a 4-hour shoot, at which point numerous times I would have to go inside and put my hands under warm water for 5 minutes and then go back out and continue to shoot. But that level of artistry comes in many different forms, because here's also a freezing soap bubble. Put on some grass that was just left over in my yard. And I want it to look like it was on fire. So this is lit with 3 lights. The main one is orange. Secondary one is red that gives you some highlights of red at the top, almost like darker flames would be. But then in order to make this not look like it was just a white balance mistake, there's a white flashlight that is off on the side that is giving some neutral tones to the frame across the way so that it does indeed feel legitimately warm inside. And that's the mix of art and science. Right?
Do you have a scientific background, Don? Because I hear you use some scientific names.
No,
blade of grass and stuff like that.
I when I see something, it often flows two ways. I'll discover something and say, "Wow, I need to learn more about that." After I've taken the photograph, and I just have a desire to learn what it was and why it happened. And sometimes when I've gathered enough of that knowledge, I can put those puzzle pieces together and come up with a new idea, a new concept. But my background is the same as yours, Rick. Advertising,
No.
which in a way is visual communication. You know, it does relate to photography in many ways, but that communication part I think is really key, where we have to understand the art and the science, and we've got to build those two things together, right? Understanding what makes a good composition, the definition of beauty, lines and shapes and compositional theory and all that stuff. That's on the art side. But on the science side, it's what's light going to do when it interacts with the subject. How is it going to pass through the lens? What about your aperture? What shutter speed do you need? All this technical stuff, right? And the deeper you can weave those two things together, I think the more magical the results will be.
That's amazing.
Rick, it sounds like know your subject.
Know your subject.
Well, and I always say too that I think to get a good, and Juan may remember the story from our podcast a while ago. I said that for me, I have to fall in love with the subject to get a good photograph. Do you remember this conversation, Juan?
Absolutely. I mean, we've had different variations of that conversation over the years many times. Is, you know, the best way to make the great images is to know your subject, right?
And to fall in love with it. So Juan and I had this podcast. This is funny. So I said, you know, I love photographing people. And if I go around, and Juan smiled because I think he remembers the story. So I go to like wherever, Myanmar, whatever. And I don't fall in love with the subject romantically. I fall in love with them saying, like, I'd love to get that photograph. Like Don's looking at this picture, this scene. He says, I'd love to get this photograph. So I say on the podcast, I say, you know, I don't love bulldozers. I don't think I could get a good picture of a bulldozer. And remember once someone sent us a link? They were the best, most artistic pictures of bulldozers I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Somebody loved bulldozers.
That is so true. And then we were shooting a bulldozer in the middle of New Mexico. Remember that?
Oh yeah, but by the very large array. But the point,
that's right, by the VLA.
So a couple of comments.
Go ahead,
One
Alan.
is just they're impressed by the way that Don thinks things through. And then on the soap bubbles themselves, we have a question on Facebook from Jennifer as to how long they will last. How long do you have to make this image?
So this one is actually frozen solid completely. Usually I photograph them when they're still freezing, like this one, like where there's puzzle pieces about to connect. And I find that to be a more useful image in most cases. And it takes them about 10 seconds rather, to completely freeze solid. So you got 10 seconds, maybe 15 if it's a little bit milder temperature. And those temperatures will be maybe about 18 Fahrenheit and colder, about like maybe minus 6 to 8 Celsius and colder than that. Typically, you get best results a couple of degrees less and absolutely no wind. But what I'll typically do is I'll set up a bubble, and it'll be my test bubble. I'll let it freeze solid, and with that one I'll adjust my lighting angles. I'll kind of figure out exactly where my camera should be, and then I'll blow that bubble away. They'll shatter to pieces when you breathe on them if they're frozen, and then I'll put another one exactly in its place, and I'll work with that bubble as my main subject. This one here just happened to look good all together because I had some really nice glowing crystal facets along the bottom, and it kind of kept that whole fire motif going up. So, I mean, it depends, Rick. It all depends on what your subject is going to be doing, but yeah, you have to work quickly. A good thing is if it fails or if it doesn't freeze the way you want it to, you just blow another bubble. And some people might be asking, well, is there a secret to blowing good bubbles? And there is, and I'll give it to you. Number one, the bubble mixture has to have white corn syrup, also called glucose syrup in some areas, in the mixture. So it's typically, for me, a ratio of 6 parts water to 2 parts just generic dish soap to 1 part white corn syrup. You can substitute glycerin as well in that case, if you whatever you have around. And the glycerin or the white corn syrup will pool at the bottom of the bubble when you're blowing it, which will cause the bubble to have a little cushion on the bottom and not pop on impact when it comes into contact with the surface. It'll still pop sometimes, but the keeper ratio is a lot better. And don't blow them through a bubble wand. It took me 2 years to realize that that's not a good idea. Use a drinking straw. And so you just blow a bubble through a straw, and then you have it at the end of the straw. You get to choose exactly how big it is. And then with a flick of your wrist, you can then place it exactly where you want it to be. So a drinking straw and white corn syrup are the secrets to getting good bubbles and to make that magic happen.
So we have people watching, a couple of people in different parts of Texas commenting that it never gets cold enough in Texas to create a bubble.
So I had a client for a documentary project that I can't mention because I'm under an NDA for it, but they requested footage of freezing crystal stuff similar to this this month. And so I had to buy a chest freezer, and I can confirm that you can do this in a freezer if it's big enough.
Did you sit in the freezer?
I did not sit in the freezer. The camera was on one end. The lights in the freezing soap bubble was on the other end. And I had the camera tethered in order to control things. But it worked. It did work.
Okay, Phyllis, you're on the right track. You would just have to stand in the freezer.
Exactly. Or, hey, if you know somebody that is a butcher that has a big meat freezer, you could ask them to borrow it for a little bit of time. And Arlene says, have you ever done crystal formation that does not involve freezing? Well, stay tuned. There might be something at the very end of this that hits on that point. Now, Rick, you might be familiar with this subject, right?
Yes.
So this is an up-close view of a butterfly wing, specifically a Madagascar sunset butterfly, which are known for their incredible colorful wings due to the fact that the wings themselves create interference patterns that separate white light into colors in a very magical way. And this, I think, it's one of two things. It's documentary, right? In the sense that I'm just documenting this as it is, but it's also craftsmanship, the same way that somebody might make a fine cabinet, in the sense that it doesn't necessarily require artistic intent, but it requires a lot of attention to detail and understanding the technical elements incredibly well. This is actually an image taken with a microscope objective, which people think, well, that's obscure, exotic, and expensive. You could get a microscope objective for like $50, and the adapter to put it on your camera might cost you 10. And so there's tutorials on that. We won't opine too much on that exact process, but the depth of field you get from a microscope objective is so razor thin. This is a single photograph out of camera from that shoot, and it required just shy of 1,000, I think 997 shots in order to focus stack this into this as a final piece. And so that was a lot of work. I mean, there's software that does the heavy lifting for you. Helicon Focus and Zareen Stacker are two dedicated focus stacking programs that will combine all of those images together. I used an automated focusing rail that calculated everything for me. And so, if you're pushing to extremes, you have to use extreme measures. But the deeper you go down this rabbit hole, folks, the more amazing the subject matter can actually be. Including otherworldly, in this case, can anybody guess what this is a photograph of? Any thoughts on this?
Go ahead.
Looks like algae, frozen algae.
Frozen. That's actually a pretty good description of it, although it's not anywhere remotely correct. But thank you, Juan. This is a micrometeorite.
I'm glad to serve your purpose.
Yeah, right.
This is literally space dust, and it measures about 1/4 millimeter across, and it's photographed with a 50 times microscope objective, and it's translucent. It's a mineral that actually has translucency to it in the form of a meteorite, which is just phenomenal. But imagine my frustration when I then had to try and light this thing. It's 1/4 of a millimeter in diameter. And I have to get a balance between surface reflection light to show the texture and transmitted light in behind to show its translucency in a single photograph at exactly the right angle for something that if I breathe, if I exhale too deeply, will disappear from reality because it will roll off of its stage and it won't be seen again.
Did you get this by putting a blanket on the roof of your house?
Well, you can do similar things. Some people have taken, just clean out your gutters and look for anything magnetic, because a lot of micrometeorites do have that they'll respond to very strong neodymium magnets, and so that's one way to do it. In fact, the guy that I got this from started his hunt for them that way, Scott Peterson. And Scott Peterson is known in the micrometeorite hunter space because that's a thing. There's a thing for everything. And he would typically go.
There's a Facebook group about it or a Reddit.
I'm sure
subreddit.
There has to be. But he is a great guy. He would go to like shopping malls that would have vinyl roofs, so that they wouldn't get all contaminated with the grit from regular shingles and things. And then he would go to their drains and collect samples on their roofs, and then take those home and examine them and find micrometeorites there. So you can find them in suburbia. You just have to know where to look. And they fall by the countless millions a year. They just become grains of sand once they get here.
I remember when I was young, that was an experiment that we did, is we actually put a white blanket on the roof of your house for a couple of days. And then you come back and you pull it up and look for things in there through a microscope, and you find micrometeorites like this.
Yeah. So there's a lot of fun things to explore on such a small scale, and I can't stress enough how much there is to see that is just unknown to our own eyes, literally around us, in the gutters of your house and in the grass at your feet and so on.
Hey, Rick, so we have David Stern here that said that he's sure his wife won't gather ants for him, but he's going to try to get her to gather some micrometeorites from her gutters.
Yes, that's
she's
good.
going tonight, so place your orders and let David know so he can get them to you.
Don is too young to remember this, but Alec probably remembers. Juan might be too young, but when we were kids, remember in the 50s, we had Kix, that cereal with the round. Yeah. This looks like that was going to be my guess. With the where Don went into Photoshop and changed the color balance.
Oh, well, hey, thank you for that also wrong guess, Rick.
It was actually, I just looked it up because I knew that wasn't what it was.
And I do remember that cereal. It's still around, actually.
Oh my God, that's like the worst thing for your teeth. That's why I have like
I know we haven't bought that for my daughter, thankfully. But somebody was asking about crystals that don't freeze. So this is a fun one. This is citric acid on a piece of glass. And so here's a fun home experiment for people to do. If you don't have citric acid around, you might be able to get something similar out of lemon juice, or a quick trip to Amazon can find a bag of citric acid that's used as a preservative or a food enhancer for about $10. Not expensive. You can mix it with water, or if you have rubbing alcohol or something else, you can mix it with that, and it'll just evaporate faster. What you do is you mix that together, and then as the water or whatever liquid evaporates, the crystals will start to reform on the glass. And I have microscope slides. If you don't, just pull a piece of 4x6 glass out of a picture frame and use that. Any piece of glass would work just fine. And you put a thin layer of that on and wait for it to evaporate. Do it in the evening, come back in the morning, and you'll have crystals. Now, they're not rainbow crystals on their own. You have to cross-polarize them, which, again, it's not a difficult thing to do. You can put that piece of glass on your phone. Every LCD screen is a polarized screen. Your computer monitor, your TV, your cell phone, etc. And if you just put white on whatever that screen is, and then if you've got a polarizer for your camera, put that on your camera lens, and spin that around until the screen on your phone goes dark. and then you'll see those rainbow colors just spring up to life. I used a slightly different process, mind you. You can see on the left-hand or the right-hand side here, rather, I've got 2 polarizing filters and a flashlight, but consider that polarizing filter with a flashlight, that could be a cell phone screen. You can use just about anything that you want in that regard, so long as it's polarized light. And I'm using a very complex setup with a microscope objective, but there are companies that make 5x macro lenses for affordable numbers. Canon has its MPE 65 millimeter lens, which I've used and loved for many years. Venus Optics has the Lioa 2.5 to 5x macro lens, and a lot of their macro lenses also go to 2x magnification, which would start getting you closer to this range. You might have to crop in a little bit. But you start to get into that realm of being able to play with this. Like, you could do this 100 times and never end up with exactly the same results. It's abstract artwork that you are, I don't want to say creating, but cultivating, I think would be a better word.
I think you're creating. You know what I like? All that technical stuff is great, but artistically, I love the movement of this. It looks, Juan and Alec, don't you think it looks like a waterfall, like over on the right? I mean, there's so much movement to the still picture. I mean, I love this one.
Yeah, you know where to go first. It's just everywhere you look, there's something interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot to look at.
It's abstract artwork. Now, I kind of get a nasty look from my wife when I show her some of these, because she is a wonderful and very accomplished abstract oil painter, and it can sometimes take her weeks or months to finish a piece. Sometimes if she's in the right mood, it'll take her an entire day nonstop with focus and revisions and so on and so forth. And I came up with a catalog of these in a day, having never attempted it before. And she was just annoyed at how beautiful it was, and how my medium of creation matched her level of beauty, in some ways exceeded in certain examples based on what she was trying to create, and she just couldn't get there. Maybe it meant that she was inspired, but at the same time, you could see the ire. So.
Well, you know what? I just looked this up because I was thinking about time it took Michelangelo 4 years to paint the Sistine Chapel. So.
Yeah, it took me 4 minutes to take a picture of his work, and so it's like that Michelangelo is Mother Nature in this case, and Mother Nature is doing the intrinsic artwork, and then I'm just photographing that as an afterthought. I mean, yes, I coerced Mother Nature into creating it, so I'm part of that process. But I can't say that I wanted this particular stroke to be here and that one to be there and so on. It's luck of the draw, and it's a lot of fun to play with. There's a few different ingredients that, if people are looking to go shopping for some of these things, ascorbic acid, which is also known as vitamin C, you can easily buy in powdered form from any health food store, creates really wonderful patterns, very similar to this. MSM, what does MSM stand? I forget. It's another supplement.
Monosodium glutamate?
Yeah, that's the one.
MSM? MSG.
You know that off the top of your head, Juan. You are, hats off to you.
Well, he just had Chinese food.
Well, yeah. I when I have Chinese food with a lot of MSG, I get vivid nightmares. So that's why I know.
So you have a lot of those different ingredients that you can get in powdered form that you can either make soluble in water, or acetate or methanol or something. Like if you've got some household cleaners, you can easily just start experimenting with this type of stuff and set up a whole station of all of these different things. And most of them will fail. And then you'll say, aha, that one worked remarkably well. And I've had far more failures with this than successes, but almost every...
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, almost every time I've tried to use citric acid, it's worked marvelously.
Well, speaking of failures, Juan and I and Alec have been talking about superpowers and what gives what superpowers a photographer may have that helps him or her become a good photographer. So you wrote something. I'd just like to read it, what your superpower is. And I think it's really important because you just touched on this. So I have it up on the screen. So basically, Don says, my superpower, you might be surprised at this, says my superpower is not caring if I'm right. I think that's pretty cool. I love to experiment, and I always have an idea in my mind of what I'd like to see, but I'm thrilled with any outcome. Failures and mistakes should be revealed in, as you don't learn anything from doing it right the first time. I'm almost done. I might hypothesize that a photographic experiment will yield fantastic results, yet it turns out to be nothing more than a blurry mess. I embrace the challenge to learn from everything, sometimes enjoying the problem-solving process more than the results. So I think your passion and your love for experimenting is really coming through in your pictures, and I know will come through in your book. Do you have a picture of the book cover, by the way?
I do. Thank you for that, Rick. That is the next slide.
Oh man!
Wow, we couldn't have planned that any better.
No, actually, we Don and I rehearsed this like for 3 days. No.
No, well, and so this book, it should have been out by now, and so my apologies to anybody that's backed it on Kickstarter or pre-ordered it. I was delaying it to add extra content, which was going swimmingly, and then the pandemic hit. My daughter was out of daycare, and I hear pitter patter on the feet upstairs, so people are chasing each other on the floor above me, and she's the reason why this book is not in people's hands yet. But anybody that pre-orders it and sends me an email, I'll send them half the book as a PDF right now, just for them to kind of sink their teeth into it, and the rest of it, it's more than half done, but the rest of it's just not completely finalized yet. And you can get that actually if you go to skycrystals.ca, and you can find it there as either an ebook or as a physical edition. And my goal is late summer, at least right now. We're in very uncertain times. I'm making progress with the book every day, but at the same time, I have no idea what tomorrow's going to bring. So anybody that wants a copy, that's how you get it. And I'm happy to send you some sample pages to keep you exploring right away.
I think that's another reason why it's not out. In addition to listening to the pitter patter of the feet, you're a perfectionist, I think.
Thank you. I'll take that as a compliment.
I look at every one of those pictures, and Juan and I, we have the critique sessions, and Alex involved in that, and we say, "Oh, we could have done this. I could have done that." Blah blah blah. I think all our viewers will agree that your work is just outstanding, and your passion really is coming through. So I can't wait to get a hard copy.
I'm sorry, Rick. Don, just repeat the website again.
It is skycrystals.ca. And that's, of course, that's not the title of this book, but it's the title of my first book. Okay. And I'm kind of piggybacking off that domain for the e-commerce methodology here. So if you go to skycrystals.ca, then you'll be able to find where you can get yourself a copy of it. And let's go down one more rabbit hole, shall we? Because we can do more stuff at home. And so in this case, I've Frankensteined a number of flashlights. I love using Frankenstein as a verb because I needed ultraviolet light. I've since discovered a far cheaper way, and that's to use ultraviolet flashlights. Anything from the name Convoy, and I'm just typing Convoy S2, and if you just type in Midnight Minerals, that's a local seller in the US anyhow that will sell those to you. And those are really cool flashlights that that will duplicate, at least for a static subject like this sunflower that I have here. You can see the flower on the back of the screen on the camera. This is in regular light. Which would be, I mean, it's not a bad image as you would see in this case. It's awfully yellow. The color palette isn't that extreme, but it's passable. If I were to turn off the room light so everything is black and fire pure ultraviolet light at this flower, what's going to happen is that if the flower does not fluoresce, which means it excites ultraviolet light into visible light. And again, I'll save you the physics lesson. We're almost out of time here. But if nothing happens, you see black. But if it does fluoresce, oh, you get a light show and you see this.
Wow.
And so that's what happens when you hit a sunflower with ultraviolet light. When your camera, unmodified lens and camera, no filters whatsoever, it's just collecting the visible light that comes back from the ultraviolet fluorescence, then you get another step down into Alice in Wonderland here.
Or like an Avatar. Remember those things were like floating around in space? This is like
in the trees,
Yeah. And this is not a version of the world that anything could normally see because there's no naturally exclusive UV light source. The sun emits ultraviolet light, but also lots of other light too. So this is purely available for our viewing pleasure as human beings that have been able to harness the power of light. No other way could this ever be seen. And I think that as photographers, we need to embrace that power, which leads me to my final image, which is probably the geekiest selfie that you've ever seen. This is ultraviolet reflectance, which is the direct observation of ultraviolet light, which requires special filters, very expensive, special lenses, custom modified cameras. And I'm wearing ultraviolet protective goggles right now that are normally clear, but they appear black. They absorb all the ultraviolet light. Like if you were to put a sunscreen on your skin, it would also appear darker because it's absorbing the UV light. So this is my Terminator macro turbo geek feel, and that's me in a nutshell. So
yeah, I was going to say that you remind me of the Terminator, and where he says, "I'll be back." So Don, we definitely want to have you back. Linda Marshall, that last picture, she said, "OMG!" People are just the comments here are just wow, wow, wow. They're just loving your work, and we love you. So I'm so glad I
there's
met
a
you.
question on the UV, Don. The wavelength, is it the long or the short wavelength?
Long for biology. I've experimented with shortwave UV, and some minerals will fluoresce under shortwave ultraviolet UVC light. That's the kind of lights that you would use to sterilize medical equipment, or again, for certain minerals, they behave interestingly. But if you're dealing with biology, I have not yet found anything to fluoresce under shortwave. It's always been long wave, and that's actually easier and less risky to play with. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
You,
We could give Don like a virtual clap. Don, I see our friend George here. What's the biggest print you ever made of one of your images?
That would be an 80 by 40 canvas.
That's pretty big.
And that was as a single piece. I've done larger in triptychs, and I've got a Canon image prograph 8400 that I do all of that printing on. It's behind me in my studio, in the second half of my studio here. I don't do a lot of the Canon image prograph, which I absolutely love. It's one of those things that I love experimenting with printing. And you might agree with me too, Rick, that a photo isn't done until it's printed in some way. Like, it just feels like it's finished when you put it on your wall and you're staring at it and light is reflecting off of it and it says, the job is done.
Well, that's what our friend George would say, who was our guest last Saturday. He's you could see him with his beard and glasses and his white shirt. He's just given us a wave. So anyway, we want to thank everybody once again. Don, thanks for spending some time with us. Juan, thanks for putting this together. Alec, you're a great moderator. So we hope we see some of you on Saturday at 11 o'clock. I honestly feel that everyone has a book inside of them, and that's going to be the topic that we're going to be talking about, how to get a book published. And we just want to thank everyone and have a safe weekend. And we'll see you next time on a new platform, right, Juan?
Yes. Yeah, we'll be posting details on the phototherapy group. But the cool thing is that URL that you're using to log into Zoom will work. That will take you to the new system. So you don't have to change anything on your end. It'll be as seamless as it can be.
Well, thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Take care, folks. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Don.
Everyone.
So Juan will come back. You and I and Alec will come back.
Yep. Take care,
everybody.
guys. Bye.